but there are serious problems in finding soil development features that can be temporarily defined in the sense that these are soil that have formed under equilibrium conditions in the last 5 or let's say 10,000 years. And there is a very widespread situation in the higher margins of the savanna as far as can be deduced from literature, personal comments that are from various people, including the Einstein's work in the Turi area, and my own experiences, that in fact they are often red soils, as they are over the fossil dune fields in the south central Sudan, and that modern soils, in fact, are much more by way of humic, grassy soils without the intensive oxidation of different kinds of clay minerals forming and so on. And it is just conceivable that unlike the sort of thing that some people suggest, there are conditions in the past where soil weathering proceeds in a slightly different direction than this. This is something that's very hard to tell and remains problematic in many parts of the world. It's the same general thing in the Mediterranean area where you cannot demonstrate terraces forming anywhere on the present. And it's even questionable here down in the southeastern United States whether in fact the podzolic, latosolic, or radiopozolics, as the various groups are called, will form on a fresh surface. So we're always dealing with uncertainties in terms of trying to find good analogs for paleosols. It's a tricky business. I would say I suspect that vegetation might have been very like what you might have often say Obeid or someplace like that. But it's just a guess. Well, Uganda is much more luxurious.
Northern Uganda, southwestern Sudan.
Is it possible that there's some kind of secondary weathering process in these formations that takes place that we don't understand yet, that perhaps these things don't form all at once in one weathering? One gets a set of preconditions for this, and then a secondary reaction takes place after the thing is in fact buried or altered some other way.
And this is, of course, something that is possible, but I can't say that there are too many situations where you get good bisequential soil developments. And I don't really know to what extent, it might help with explanatory certainly, the stabilized Gaza, it's called, in central Sudan and in northern Nigeria, to take that example, it's an area now with very dense vegetation and so on. And yet the red soils are on them for all practical purposes. Seem to be possible in the sense that where they have been removed and so on, they have reformed. And I just think that, one has to deal with great caution in interpreting paleosols because of the fact that you can't really find ever a solid analog. They're really qualitative things in great care.
You were suggesting that it is actually a post-burial alteration, which
It could be,
takes it out of
perhaps.
the range of all the analogs.
Perhaps
Yeah.
this sets up a set of conditions that might, after burial through groundwater action or something, lead to.
Yeah. Well, we certainly saw this in the region I'm very sure that the recent grants have become a completely different, distinctive set of deposits which are well represented in the older Pleistocene formation. And we found one or two places in the recent Pleistocene where alteration seems to be going on faster, and they're already going, you can already see it happening. And yet, when you see the two poles of the series, they're short region. Is this an appropriate part of our meetings, or if we're going to discuss it at all, to raise some questions about paleoenvironment in general, paleoenvironmental history, and relationships between the Nile and other areas.
We raised some of those questions. This is the most appropriate time.
One of the question that's been puzzling me since the literature on the Nile, particularly since the Hunter reports, been coming out, is that the discussion is in terms of high water levels, almost as it's put in the text, as though these are high lake levels. And yet, from my knowledge of geomorphology, I'm nearly sure that the high water levels, at least this is the first question that I'm asking, are in fact achieved not necessarily by large volumes of water, but by the fact that the silt plain is built up. Is this understanding correct? It's not so much that we're dealing with larger volumes of water, but the valley is filled up with silt. The next point that has intrigued me is the fact that now that there are a series of carbonates or lakes in the area just south of the Sahara, from which, of course, the Nile gets its water, Victoria, Ethiopia, and across the Chad, it appears that there's an extensive offset between the periods when you have high lakes in just south and the periods when you have high Nile siltation. That is, for instance, all the lakes in Chad, the Eastern Rudolph, Lake Victoria, appear to be low just back about 10 or 11,000 years ago. And yet, this is the period when you have one of your major siltation high-level periods, the Sahaba. And it does seem to me it raises the question of whether the notion that the siltation is taking place in a condition of high volume discharge from Ethiopia. For instance, it's hard to imagine why Rudolph should have left at a time that the Ethiopian highlands are showing maximum volumes of water. And maybe we really have to get back to the notion that it's the water to silt ratio which is affected rather than the water itself.
Why don't you run it?
The different formations vary in terms of an explanation of what the Nile itself is doing. Relevant to what the situation locally in Egypt is. The Vera or Masmas formation, as I call it, is very similar to the modern Nile floodplain in many ways. But it is very much wider. In the Kamongo Plain, where I had good opportunity to study, there's a huge floodplain. And good sections going through it and showing the details of how things developed. I would think that, in fact, there was more available overbank discharge than at the moment. For the simple reason, because something that is very unique in the deposits I saw, namely the evidence of silt and sand splays, the sort of thing that happens when a levee is breached by very severe floods, something that's quite unique almost to the Mississippi Valley and the Amazon, places where the flood surge is very much stronger. And where the lower points of the levees will break as water builds up, a certain amount of velocity and so on, and a surge of silt and sand will be laid down with a sort of undulating rippling texture with a local fan-like definition beyond the levee. You find this in this Masmas or Vera, so that I don't think that the Nile discharge was less. I think it was probably greater. In the case of the younger formations, my Double Silsila formation, with all the various subparts and their apparent equivalents, the river behaved rather differently than it does today or at any other time that we have records of, namely the constant shifting of channels, very rapid breaching, replacement, and so on, and much coarser overbank sediments than there are at the moment. Very little by way of clays, substantially, much higher silt, very fine sand proportions. And this again would suggest to me that the proportion in this case of bed load to suspended load is different. And in indicative of greater discharge. Now, going to Ethiopia, I become more and more perplexed from the Omo system, where you've got the same rainfall source. In fact, you've got the drainage basins of the Blue Nile and the Silbat and the Omo are closely digitated. They are, in fact, in a sort of jigsaw contact, so that you're getting just about the same rainfall. And it doesn't match properly. Apparently, at first it did, but now as all the dates are falling into place, there are discrepancies that are striking and very hard to explain. And the period represented by the Berager or Vasanas was a dry period in the Omo Basin. There is no record of sedimentation at all. The period represented by the Sahara is blank. And at 9,500 or 10,000 BP, in other words, 8,000 or so, is that Lake Archean or something? It's my terminal Armina member of the Jebel Silsra. All of a sudden, the lake comes up and the river starts acting up like mad, and Lake Rudolph overflows into the Nile system.
Yeah, I think this is related also to this phenomenon we were discussing yesterday. On the west bank of the Nile, the dunes were migrating at the time when the Berager was reaching its maximum. And that in the interval when the Nile had cut, there were ponds forming, there were soils forming, there were permanent ponds. You see, the significance of those interdune ponds is that the temperature of something was low enough. Whether or not the water got in by rainfall, which I'm skeptical and doubtful about, I would say it's more likely it's seepage from the Nile, not too distant away. But it was at a lower level and sufficiently low that floods did not carry over into these ponds because there were no Nile silts in them. And so this means there were not seasonal ponds that dried up each year, but permanent ponds, some depth of water. And then in the end of the Sahaba, we have a similar phenomenon in the area of the Hina Bend. Just downstream from there, immediately after the Sahaba, there's a ponding episode that occurs there after the Sahaba has cut in an abandoned swale. Permanent ponds again developed without intrusion of Nilotic ponds, suggesting that that the periods of whatever, and the wadis were also flowing during these times, and not perceptibly, at least during the grades during the period of Sahaba aggregation and Berager. So the suggestion that the local rainfall may well have been a little bit higher during the periods when the Nile was down, rather than the periods when the Nile was higher. Stabilization, again, not only the body, stabilization of the dunes, but vegetation, formation, consistent soils on the surface. So, I'm not, in fact, that agrees very well with most of it. We've studied this. I guess last year, that the intervals of maximum aggregation were relatively dry compared to the
Doesn't call that data, which at least in my understanding originally contrary to that. Didn't your bodies
I would say that
indicated
our dating and correlations indicate that, in fact, there are correlations. For example, in the case of the first high channel of the Sahaba, or Jebel Silsila formation, the Coral Seal, for example, 15,000. This is where, in fact, we have the correlates of silt building up in the big wadis to the east. And the case of the stuff around 3000 BC, my last member of the Jebel Silsila formation, you have very nice vegetation of the high floodplain silts with, in fact, quite good activity in wadis as defunct as the Koradin, where you can show, in fact, that the wadi was active at the time when the floodplain was dry, and pre-worked little plates of Nile sills and carried these along. And then again, during the other part of the year when the wadi was defunct, the Nile silts came in and were suspended in small little swales within the wadi alluvia. So you've got a very strong point-by-point correlation on this. And I think that what you're probably getting, and this may be significant, and I think that your sections from the Esna area are shedding a lot of light on this, now that we can correlate things better as I've seen them, is that the period from, let's say, 15,000 to 10,000 BC was really very complex. That, in fact, our record of Colombo may be just for some of the channels and periods of temporary aggradation within that span. And in fact, our coarse bedload deposit may only represent a part of it. And that it was a very variable period of time for all I can tell. This begins to make much more sense to me now seeing these other sections. And I think the truth is always sort of trying to get the best mesh at the end. And I think this is what we're finally going to get now with sort of adjusting the east and west bank situations, which obviously are quite unalike in many places. It's only when you get the precision of good isotopic taking that in fact makes sense out of it.
Coming back to the dichotomy you mentioned between the siltation and the rise of the body of water, I don't think that there is such an advantage that we're talking about, because siltation is never denied. I would have to say by aesthetic factors and by economic factors there. And so it's actually depending on the volume of water and the load, and then the bottleneck. So if you have high insertion of exceeded water and loaded with still, then you have continuous deposition and degradation and rise at the high level. So there's no dichotomy actually between siltation and volume.
Well, that's not certain. And certainly the data in America on the relationship between discharge and siltation suggests that the deposition is at a maximum when the actual volumes of water fall. Although very commonly this goes with flooding, high velocities for short periods of time.
It depends on the
But,
balance,
um,
the balance
yeah.
between the load and
But it certainly isn't true that the rivers of the highest discharge necessarily
No.
are silting their valley.
unless the high discharge is associated with a very high load.
Well, certainly because there's a higher discharge, a higher maximum potential there. The
Problem is not
practical correlation.
No, I think there's a very important consideration here, and that is the contrast of bed and suspended load in the two ratios. These vary considerably under different conditions. The idea of capacity, in other words, total load carrying capacity, as opposed to competence to carry coarse materials in the bed, are again quite different things. And if you in fact change the ratio of suspended to bed load, you get different capacities and competencies. And these are all very complicated things that you can't explain by a single model.
No.
You have to in fact take the field evidence, and on the basis of your value cross-section, you have to infer what the river was doing. Because every set of behavior is different for every set of channel bed you cut.
Could
This is why I'm sort of reticent to go beyond certain kinds of generalizations, because it's only when I in fact have enough field evidence to support what happened that I will go and make an inference for it. And in the case of these Egyptian materials, the different formations in fact reflects different kinds of balances. Quite distinct.
Well, you answered my question very well earlier, and this was exactly the kind of thing that I hadn't seen in the literature before. There was simply an unstated assumption that siltation and high levels would correspond with maximum flow volumes. You gave specific reasons other than just high level and siltation for believing in at least you phrased your answer in terms of maximum flood velocities. And this is, I suppose, another possibility that the regime, even if the total volume was no larger or that it could even have been smaller, the maximum flood velocity.
Right. I don't think it would be misstating the Hudson's position to say that he did feel that there would be a correlation between the maximum aggradation of the Nile and maximum fluid conditions in East Africa.
Oh, well, he said it, yeah.
I think that was his view at the time.
But he didn't go through all the steps in the argument to defend that.
We shouldn't speak unkindly of those not present, but this is the lack of understanding of how these things go on. And this thing surprises me, you know, that it's possible in the 1960s and now 1970s, in fact, to go around and see it, so the thing don't get your head locked off.
It was interesting that we made every effort in the world to get Whiteman to visit our cuts and things.
He's a strange man.
He wouldn't come. He was camped 200 meters from our excavations. He wouldn't come to look. So that makes him.
I have a 5-year history of trying to interrelate with the guy. In fact, visit him in Khartoum, and every time I write, he's not in. And then he comes out afterwards, 3 years later, with the misconception of something or other, and he's ready to blast off into the legislative nature, and he was going, for example, he had described the attitude of Iceland on his interpretation of how these stones are graded. And I wrote him back and said, "Are you sure you got the literature?" And he just didn't even have that. He just had the 1965 report of yours. And he obviously isn't interested in sort of trying to figure out what's going on in the world.
He doesn't want the facts.
So,
I might mention something possibly relevant to this. I'll emphasize again, I wasn't doing any geological work, but I was in the Hadramaut, South Arabia, and being familiar with the same literature that Lynn said, I interpreted what I saw there in terms of some of the Samaritan work. You have a very thick fill in the Wadi Hadramaut, going at least 300 feet of sills. And the upper 30, 40 feet at least of these are very recent. They've got pottery and lots of wells in the area. There are still well irrigation. The Arabs know the underground drainage pretty well. It's a very wide wadi, and the tributary wadis bring in loads of gravel. They sound comparable to sort of the Carlsbad here. And rainfall is exceedingly infrequent. The Arabs say about once every 7 years they expect to be rainfall in these wadis, and they know when surface water is going to be flowing in these buried gravels. And there's been, my impression was very rapid, late Pleistocene, perhaps entirely post-Pleistocene silting in here. It's a mile or two across this one. Thick silts with these interdigitated, very coarse gravels. Seems to me now the Pleistocene channel, that pertains to flow from the highlands of the Yemen. Now that is all subsurface flow now, so it begins to come out on the surface far down, green towards the coast when you're in fairly narrow gorge and no thick silt. But anyway, here seems to be a case where you have this very heavy lateral introduction of coarse sediment from tributary wadis with a fine sediment, very rapid fill in the main wadi. Now, what I don't know, of course, here is the sort of, these are not Yemen sediments involved in very upper this, I'm sure there must be derivation. But anyway, this seems quite clear to me to be tied in with a very low rainfall regime. That's the sort of situation that I'm familiar with in this country.
which of course in the case of Egypt, when because the Hadramaut is a lush place like Paris, present Egypt, South Cairo.
Well, there's almost no rainfall.
But it's still in order of factor 10 greater.
Well, I think it's less than 2 or 3 centimeters a year.
Yeah, well, you get such things as less than 2 or 3 millimeters.
Yeah. And it comes in the form of these very sporadic local rainfalls that allow for torrential flow in a particular wadi.
And it's except when we go out in the field, Carol, by the way, it always rains. Rain in Luxor, the
We have a
first
6-inch rain, you know, a 6 inches we drop. Yeah, I think it might be about that.
Stop for about 10 minutes or so.
Once we call it first year, it rains in Luxor.
So, all right, so 12:15, all right. I wanted to ask something that Smith and I just discussed for a moment. Desmond, what is the status, or do you know, of the Dakar Pan-African Congress? Is it going to appear, or?
I don't know any more.
Then
I
you told me.
wrote on several occasions before I went off to the Sahara at the end of the year to Hugo and got no reply at all. I wrote to Balu about this and said, is Hugo going back to Dakar, because we'd heard that he was seriously ill, and that being the case, one wanted to know what would be done about the proceedings. Balu, it looked, reading between the lines, as if he hadn't actually had anything very much to do with getting the compte rendu together, as had been left to Hugo. And he simply said he understood that Hugo expected to get the money. Hugo is back in Dakar now, but we've heard nothing about the compte rendu at all.
Anybody else have any additional information about it? A lot of us have had papers in this. We pulled our papers for the OMO out. They'll be out in, there were 5 of them. They'll be out in Quaternary 11 in June. And I think that we were right. And Phil has a paper in press, for example, and various other people. And well, a word to the wise.
One of the things that is suggested was that he might get in touch with Jacques Nankin to see the possibilities of getting the proceedings published in the Taboran Museum series, as was the Leopoldville Congress. Jacques seemed to think that there
was in former Belgian Congo, and this is former French West Africa.
This might be, but I think Hugo probably wished to do it, find money elsewhere.
Yeah, I'm really very surprised, and especially now that there's a lot of pressure being exerted as to where the next Congress will be, which we talked about the other night.
Looking at the lists of those who may vote and adding them up, I think one can determine whether it's going to be.
They'll put it wherever they want, but the question is they can't seem to publish the proceedings, so I would say that's kind of a bad show. This is a real problem for the future, and I think wherever it meets, there's got to be some real exploratory work done once it's decided that it's going to meet in place X, that a group of people, maybe having nothing to do with the organization of it, should really take on themselves the job of making sure that this can be published. And it could be done like the last Inqua was done in a series of volumes. It could be fed to several journals. But it just shouldn't be allowed to sit there. What's the point in having the Congress then?
The other suggestion, we're in a better situation than we were in the past, because we are now affiliated to the Commission in Radiohistorical Science, so therefore are eligible for UNESCO money. And this, I think, will be a considerable benefit in finding funds for the publication of the compte rendu, and also funds for the running of the Congress in the future.
It isn't, of course, only a problem of funds. I mean, it's partly a problem of someone to do the work. But a suggestion which at least interests me, that Sherry Washburn made once about this kind of conference, is that in many ways the best form of publication is that people are required to submit clean type copies, which then are just done straight away by photo offset.
That's right.
And that you don't go through the business of editing and typesetting and so on. That you simply collect. If you want to publish your paper, it has to be a clean, orderly type copy, and then take it and photo offset it, and it can be done then in 3 or 4 months.
Well, it can be done, but it's the old story that you have to make sure that there's 1 or 2 people who are going to set the deadlines and are going to follow up on these things and say that, it's 5 days to the deadline now, and as of midnight, there's no paper, these are going to press. And that's, some people that you'll have to retype their papers anyway.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what you say.
How do you set up distribution or something like that, though? I mean, the way it's been in the past, there's always been a publisher to which you could go to buy it. Just kind of.
Well, I don't think that
would be done by printing.
Yeah, it could be, this is just the device. Various people would then take it and, a variety of sources could distribute it or actually publish it.
Well, furthermore, if Hugo is not, if we're not going to, if there's no active arrangements for the publication, we ought, I think, to try to do something to see if funds, we can raise funds from somewhere else. Because there are a number of important papers in that. I mean, people who are interested in the later Pleistocene, Neolithic and so on, there's a lot of important papers there.
That's right.
They'll just get buried and lost.
I think it wouldn't be a bad idea. It's not that hard. Those who are immediately involved should certainly write, and those who don't have papers in it ought to write too, because that's the best way to make an impression. Those who were at the Congress would probably have decided long before now that actually it looked pretty dim even then.
Yeah.
That's another. You want to take about 15 minutes or so dealing with so-called Middle Paleolithic, etc. kinds of problems before spending the bulk of the remaining time, which is really where it should be spent, on later and final Stone Age things before we go to lunch. Tony says 5, that's sorry. All right, 5 minutes. All right.
Well, if we're going to use terminology like Middle Paleolithic, may I ask
Middle
where,
Stone Age, whatever.
or Middle Stone Age, where the stuff that looks suspiciously like Sangoan yesterday fits?
This is what we refer to as Nubian Middle Stone Age.
Okay.
We also made a point that that term was kind of an organizational term which was strictly local.
Yeah, well, okay.
Not
If
see
the-
it as outside of.
Then the question I'd like to raise is
We
appropriate
all know
then
what
at
it
this
means,
moment.
right?
Yeah.
Okay.
This one under Section 3, Item 1 here says, to what extent will ecological conditions be reflected in lithic artifacts? Inasmuch as Desmond and others have suggested that this kind of thing in Central Africa goes with heavily forested, or at least forested conditions. And from what I've been hearing about the Nubian and Egyptian area here, although we're getting pretty far upstream here, I realize. Still, this situation, we had a thick deposit of, quote, loess, wind-blown deposits, which of course doesn't have anything to do with the ecology of the gravels, but it suggests to me the possibility that somewhere in that range of time we didn't encounter heavy forests in this area. I don't know if enough work has been done there, but I would just like to throw out this question. Is there any suggestion at all that Carl or anyone knows of where you might have had conditions sufficiently different from those today where you could expect forest cover in any of this area?
Can I just say something about this question of forests? So, two things at stake here, I think. One is that people were starting to live in forest country. The other is that they were starting to use a lot more wood in various ways. So they were starting to work it in a systematic way, wood and the byproducts of wood and so on. Now, so far as the forest situation is concerned, the recent work in the Congo and in Angola certainly suggests that during the later Pleistocene, the conditions there over part of the Congo basin, namely the Kalahari sand region that rims the southern part and goes up into the west and actually across the Congo River, that there was a lot of grassland in association with woodland. In other words, you've got the kind of long dry season that you find in, say, places like Barotseland, what is that, 26 degrees south, not as much as that. And the conditions were not essentially conditions of forest, such as you find in the Congo and large parts of the Congo basin today, in the central Couvert certainly. So that we're not dealing with occupation of moist, humid rainforest. And such evidence as there is from northeast Angola, so far as pollens are concerned, suggests that there were cooler-loving vegetation there, rather than and that the moist, humid forest had disappeared from that area. So I think, so far as forest is concerned, I would, and I think have already gone back on the question of perhaps pushing into sort of something like the Ettori. That leaves one with the question of much more extensive use of wood and the byproducts, and I think this, I would suggest that this still holds good.
What's the real evidence for the use of wood in those
Well, examination of the working ends of these core axes and picks and so forth, or rather the whole specimen themselves, shows that the end itself is one that was extensively used. There's blunting of this and actual resharpening of them. You can see they'd be resharpened by blows struck on the side, the profile, and also on the flat, and we get the resharpening flakes as well. There's reasonably heavy blunting on some of these, not the kind of blunting that you get if they were used for digging in the ground, which produces a rather fine polish, and polish of the irites in particular. But the kind of blunting that experiment suggests could follow from the use from working woods, fairly hard woods. There's very little blunting, in point of fact, quite extensive damage. Working of wood will produce very little blunting, but there is evidence for this on these Sangoan core axes, hand axes, whatever you want to call them. And I would suggest that that was some evidence of important evidence. As well, there is serration and denticulation on the many serrated denticulated pieces of the small flake tools. And there's also, might perhaps be evidence of the use of these in connection with smoothing wood, because in the Congo today, certainly spoke shaves and things made of iron have this toothed form of cutting edge in order to groove into the wood, to dig into the wood, and so you get better results that way than if you have something with a perfectly smooth edge, which simply scratches. Desmond, do you accept the industry at the assemblies at Koro Abu Anja Sangoan?
I would hate to call it Sangoan. It has certain elements. I haven't seen it, at least I've seen some of it very, very superficially. I remember when we were going to one of the congresses, I forget which one it was, in the Khartoum Museum, shortly after Arkell had found this. Otherwise, I haven't seen it other than illustrations.
I've seen it.
And you've seen it?
It doesn't look like that stuff from Kashmagirba at all. It's a very finely finished hand axe. It's quite thin and well pointed. In fact, I have a small collection here in the basement. If anyone would like to see some of it.
Oh, yeah. I would have said that much of these fine foliate forms suggest something rather not Sangoan so much as what is being called Lupemban. But again, I think it would be highly dangerous and unsatisfactory to use those terms, either of those terms. We're not dealing with material from Nubia and the Nile.
Does it have other things in it that are like other elements of the Lupemban?
That I don't know. My recollection of all I saw were hand axes. I thought one or two crude core axe forms and these fine foliates. And I don't know what percentages there are of these.
They said foliates also occur at Wanyanga.
Yes.
But one would presume that eventually the notion that it may or may not be linked to the Lupemban and the Congo Basin stuff really depends on knowing something about the intervening portion of the Sudan, that really one should postpone a decision until we find out whether there's a continuous distribution and stuff.
Well, we had as well at Adrabus, which is right up in the desert in the Tenere, fine foliate points with the Alterian. I mean, this is characteristic of the Alterian as well as the pedunculate forms, and a host of small flake materials, scrapers, and so on. But I don't think that this represents anything that you can describe as Lupemban influence or penetration or anything of this kind. I think it simply is the local adaptation of the population to whatever it was that they were exploiting. If you needed foliate forms
forms of point. You made foliate forms of point, whatever these things were used for. Maybe in sticking into elephants or something of this kind.
What's the size
I don't
of
think.
these?
Sorry.
What's the size of these foliates that you
They
found?
go up to about there,
That size.
and some of them down to about there.
Okay.
And sometimes smaller, broken ones, which are because they've been resharpened. About there.
You know, there are some, in Nubia, there are some assemblages with quite large numbers of these foliates. If they are related in some way to a Tyrian, they never, as far as I've been able to determine, never occur with pedunculates. There are no Tyrian-like sites, to my knowledge, in the Nile Valley.
Well, these in the Sahara are unquestionably associated, not only there, but also at El Bayad up in the Mauritanian Adrar.
We
So
also
exactly
found
the
these
same
things in the desert, that is west of the Nile, at several Tyrian sites at the Dungo Well area that we surveyed. It had foliates and as well as pedunculates, but in the Nile Valley we don't have.
The pedunculates in the Tyrian sites, Dungo, were considerably different from those on the Nile, particularly in terms of size. They're extremely small.
The foliates.
The foliates, extremely well worked in the Dongle area, with quite beautiful Levallois and very nice pedunculates. In the Nile Valley, the foliates are really quite large in this range.
As big as that.
Yeah.
Well, some of them are pemmican ones, of course, when they're sometimes called daggers.
But we had no small ones. That could be considered, I think,
Yeah.
Tyrian.
But I tend to think of these things in terms of sort of, say, the modern ethnography, where if you need a broad-bladed spearhead, you use a broad-bladed spearhead for stabbing or something like this. If you want other kinds, arrows, bows and arrows, and so on. So you get the local adaptation to it. I think of it in no other terms than that. I think that there's no what's got to divorce people, groups, entirely from any consideration of the lithic component.
Still, I think there's a point which leads into this discussion perhaps this afternoon, that you have some assemblages in this general time range we're talking about, which have no foliates in them, and same approximate technological complexity, but totally without any foliates. And you might then ask the question, are these differences really activity things, or are these, is this something that has a different origin to it?
Has the question been answered as to whether or not there were trees?
Yeah, that's what I'm still wondering.
Well, Roy Carlson gave a talk at the Africanist meeting in Montreal last fall on his work at Cor Abuancha. He maintains that it is Sankhon, and but denies that there was any trees or vegetation in the area at the time. I can't remember the geological evidence he presented. I've got it back in the hotel, I think.
This was
Roy Carlson.
Carlson.
I work with the...
Who's at Vancouver, right?
No, Simon
Fraser.
Simon.
Well, can we have a clarification of there's no trees? Because parts of the world where there really aren't any trees, they almost don't occur. I mean, even in the central Australian desert, where there's blooming little of anything, the Aborigines make quite big wooden objects. And they use actually remarkably Sankhon-like things for blocking up. There's big, broad spear throwers and so on. It's very interesting. There isn't, obviously. You don't have to have thousands of trees before you get interested in making tools out of wood.
Yeah, in this case, it made that very clear in the Bishop and Clark talk.
Sure.
Could I just point out another thing? I spent some years working in a semi-arid area where the only tree growth was a very dense thorn gallery right on the bank of the Orange River, and this strip was literally inaccessible. You couldn't get through it. The snakes somehow seem to get a little denser around there, and the gullying of the banks as well was such that it was simply impossible to walk along the riverbank. You were constantly taking detours up country to get around these 20, 30 foot deep gullies. And this kind of environment is simply not going to be used. I will, of course, say there weren't any sites in there simply because I didn't walk through it. I wouldn't know one way or the other. But I think it's very unlikely anyway that this sort of microhabitat is going to be used. It's just very dangerous and very awkward. There are other factors involved in the lack of site distribution along the riverbanks itself. Adjacent to the gallery, there are flat floodplains, and some of these have been ploughed up, and presumably we did lose surface material through having it ploughed into the ground. But it only takes a few trees to make wood available, and I see no reason why you shouldn't have extensive woodworking in rainfall of 5 inches or something like this, as long as you have the river flowing through it.
Remember our guy's in a Sakia bush area now. And there's if there was any increase at all in available precipitation back at that time, as I think we've heard from Carl, sufficient evidence suggests there may well have been a good deal more dense than present.
I'd like just to quote one other example here of McCalman's discovery of a so-called lower Lupemben just north of Windhoek in southwest Africa. I believe the rainfall is something like 12 inches or something like this. Anyway, it's definitely a great deal more arid than the conventional Lupemben distribution zone. So I think
it's
really
probably
seek out distinctive rainfall or ISO heights for cultural distribution. I don't think it's going to work.
in the Egyptian case, it's pertinent probably that when the wadis anywhere on the East Bank are off the fringe of grazing areas or off caravan routes across the desert, you usually have very widely spaced 2, 4, 6 inch thick acacia tortillers, which can be very easily cut. They don't form an extensive brush where, like in the Orange Valley, where you come out half alive after trying to go through the bush. And presumably this is the case today. There must have been available wood, regardless of whether it was a forest or whatever that may have been, we can't tell, present in many of the wadi situations. And it sort of sounds amusing. How does Mr. Carlson know there wasn't any wood available at Corabuanga? I'd like to know myself. I don't know of any criterion we have from such situation where you can tell.
Well, it depends as well, of course, the definition of Sangan. I mean, some people confine the term to something rather like what we were looking at yesterday, the part of the later Pleistocene, whereas others will use the term to include everything within a certain region in Africa, Congo Basin, Cabo Verde, East Africa, right up to almost to the end of the later Pleistocene.
No, the regional thing is an important point, because the question, the Sangan Lupemben in a loose way definitely forms a cultural area in Africa, in Stone Age Africa. I mean, I don't think this is really beyond dispute. The extent to which it's homogeneous and so on is a point for investigation, but that there are a distinctive set of stone industries which belong in an area which geographically is centered on the Congo Basin is in effect an established fact. The question of whether the industries are as they are because they're associated with what happens to be a rather more densely part of Africa than some other parts is an altogether different order, but the geography of it is reasonably clear. And it is a sort of culture area.
That's the point where I thought we were going to try to discuss, though.
Yeah, sure.
Well, we're going to try to discuss that now in the sense that, first of all, it is, I suppose, clear, those of us who saw the material, that this does have very strong special relationships to the, I mean, these are not generalized resemblances, these are particularistic resemblances in the assemblies we saw here to Sango and things. Is that so?
I would say so, yes, certainly. I mean,
Well, in the same case, then, can you say that there are special resemblances between what has been labeled here denticulate Mousterian with what is labeled denticulate Mousterian somewhere else? Because we're really talking about the same order of question in this case. That's not infringing on this afternoon, by the way, either. That's something else. So can we look at the two things together in this respect? Is it valid? First of all, if you do agree that there are very close relationships, then what is the next step, really?
Could I kick off here and suggest that the next step simply has to be better numerical control of our data? We are still waiting for an entirely dependable primary context horizon for the Sangoan, a so-called floor in inverted commas. We are still waiting for this occurrence to crop up in the archaeological record alongside associated fauna, and hopefully wooden tools too to finally sort the whole problem out, as Desmond has repeatedly put it over to us. And I think it's a very strong argument using ethnographic parallel. The fact still remains we haven't found it in the ground yet, and there's just a remote fighting chance that these may be big animal butchery tools, say, and the battering, bruising, edgeware and all the rest of it may be the result of bone bashing or something like this. This is a wild guess, and it's based on no data. And the trouble is we need more reliable samples of Sangoan, and we need a formalized definition of what the Sangoan is. And the material that we've seen lying on the table yesterday struck everyone as Sangoan. Everyone responded in the same way and said, yes, it looks like the Sangoan. But at the same time, we can't actually line it up with a large number of analyzed samples from elsewhere in Africa and make it show that it fits within some range of variation for the Sangoan.
Well, the critical point, I think everyone would agree, the critical point is that it sticks out like a sore thumb compared to anything else that's ever been found in this area. And
we do
it
have
poses a special kind of problem, and I think that's also the case, I may say so, with what was called denticulate Mousterian.
May I speak
here.
to the denticulate Mousterian?
Yeah.
I think that in discussing similarity, and this is of course something that's going to come up more particularly this afternoon, how you estimate similarity and what you do with it when you've got an estimate of it. But one has to recognize the difference between the similarity of things because they are generalized and lack specific, highly defined features which separate them, and the similarity of things which have highly specific forms in common. And certainly my reaction to denticulation is that it's a fantastically generalized feature, and that almost any stone tool industry which doesn't have clearly standardized, well-defined forms has a lot of denticulates. This is true of the early stone industry in Australia. It's true of almost all the Acheulean, rather generalized, non-standardized flake tool industries. And I really don't think it's useful to think in terms of denticulate Mousterian cultural tradition. I think that if you're making rather simple scrapers and you don't take a great deal of care over them, a lot of them will be denticulate.
Yeah, I think you have, there's a question whether denticulate Mousterian, even as conceived of in Europe, can be thought of as a cultural tradition.
No,
this is well over
that's true. Yeah, I would concede that.
Now, could we graft this problem onto the Sangoan? Supposing someone was being a little careless about making his hand axes, are we going to get something that looks like the Sangoan, or is that an analogy which is just not going to fit that situation?
Yeah, the Acheulean certainly oscillates in the Sangoan direction throughout its history. You can find some industries which have cruder, heavier forms. There are some more specific forms that are rare. Some of these flat-based forms. The collection that we saw here yesterday, I wouldn't say was 100% certainly Sangoan, in the sense that the really distinctive things in the Sangoan, perhaps, well, the pendulum is easy to characterize by its core axis, which I don't know in any other context in African or indeed any other Stone Age. But the early Sangoan does have some of these flat-based picks with undercut trimming and so on. Those were not properly represented. They're things which move in that direction, but they're not unlike, for instance, early Acheulean triedras, the ones that we saw yesterday.
Those also don't occur in the kinds of Sangoan or Lupemban like that in the Luanga Valley that was also made on cobbles.
Yeah.
It seems to require an angular kind of rubble to make that kind of thing, which is in great abundance in the Sangoan type areas.
Now, there are three kinds of explanations that have sort of been brought out here, and it may be well to specify these. One has to do with whether or not the Sangoan may be related to some kind of environmental like woodworking. Another, that it may be related to a group of people. There may be a cultural group that somehow is making certain kind of tools. And thirdly, that it may in some way be related to generalized technological factors, how you make tools given certain raw material and other things. And
Or all three.
Or all three, yes. All right, well, I think it may be appropriate to consider. It may be appropriate to specifically address ourselves to these, to what we're really talking about, and instead of jumping and wandering quite as much as we have. Is it possible to focus on these or bring forth other possible explanations?
Yeah,
Well, Garth's question wasn't actually answered.
Well, could I just reiterate, I'm not going to try and answer it myself, but the strength of the case for the denticulate Mousterian is based entirely on the fact that you have very fine control, you have the systematics, and you have large, unselected, undistorted samples from Europe. You can demonstrate to us, as you did, this is the range of variability for the denticulate Mousterian in Europe, and look, my sample fits within that range. Now, we haven't got this control for this thing we are calling the Sangoan yet, and until we do that, perhaps we should even delay this kind of discussion.
Well, that's what I think Glenn has to talk to.
Well, there's one published account of this in the Pamongwe cave, which originally was called something different, but undoubtedly, and then the man, Cook, came round to describing it as Sangoan. That is defined public. It's one in which the large corax pig element is at a minimum, but it exists there, and I think this is probably due to some activity differences, the distinction between the cave sites and the open sites down by the streams and the rivers.
What about the
Colombo
small
Falls, we have, I think, probably a satisfactory sample, but regrettably, this has not been, I regret this has not been published in final form as yet, although there are statistical accounts available for one of the assemblages there, and published illustrations of it. I think the answer is that we can't really define satisfactorily the Sangoan over a sufficiently wide region to determine whether it does have any, whether there are any connections, environmental, with population or otherwise, with Nubia. We simply just have the forms, and that is all there is. All one can do is to say these appear to be similar to a certain element only present in the Sangoan, because the Sangoan means vastly more than simply just these large forms that we've been talking about. There are a host of small artifacts associated.
Well, we have the problem of the Sangoan, or of a time, let's say, when apparently Sangoan is being made in Nubia and nothing else is. And there's one kind of a problem in considering the relationship of these things. And then there's also another problem when you consider that following this, you get something different. And this raises the question of what happened, why. And it may be that requires a different kind of explanation from understanding Sangoan as a unit.
Glenn?
I just wanted to say something back to Garth's question here. When we discussed these kind of problems at the Berg-Bartenstein Symposium, I believe it was Dr. Kleindienst, myself, and a few others, were a bit exercised about these formal units, the culture stratigraphic units. And that essentially is what Garth was saying we lack the evidence for. I think that's quite clear. In order to define a culture stratigraphic unit, we have to get the stratigraphic context in these other kind of things he's speaking about, and that's where the formal terminology sits in. A number of us felt, however, there are these vaguer kind of concepts, and I think I would agree with Garth that perhaps that isn't the thing to go into at this meeting. One has pretty strong feeling that something exists here, we just haven't been able to pin it down yet. In the meantime, it is still, it's not nearly as vague as these kind of LSA, MSA kind of terms that have been around. It's still, just from the fact that those of us familiar with this sort of material in Africa immediately spotted this stuff as, my feeling was it didn't represent everything that's in Sangoan, but there wasn't a single piece out there that one couldn't put into the Sangoan assemblies in the type area.
And it wasn't Acheulean. I mean, as soon as
Yeah,
you,
right.
if you know anything about the Acheulean, there's
And I
nothing
think
Acheulean about it.
and I think these kind of terms are very useful, and I happen to be working in the type area now, and I'm valiantly struggling to be able to put this into a stratigraphic context. I am not confident yet that I'll be able to do it, but I think I would agree with Garth, probably for the meetings here, it wouldn't be too much worth our while to spend time at this and try to work more on these kinds of material that we do have better context for than Sangoan.
Fred had a question.
May I ask, just a, this kind of information is not readily available to me. Are the sites that we call, have been called Sangoan, and that have high frequencies of these pick-like tools, are they predominantly down in the valley, in areas where they might have been quarrying for stone?
No.
No.
Well,
because
both.
there was that possibility in this particular instance.
Yeah, both actually. The type areas are largely hilltops.
This is Uganda.
In Uganda, yeah, the Sango Hills and the Guyas, in the Guyas area, they're quite flat hilltops. But they also occur on the slopes, and one site that I excavated was pretty near a valley bottom, and Wayland also excavated a few sites in the Orchinga Valley in the rubbles. And I've looked sympathetically on one of the old interpretations of Broy about some of these things, that these were for digging in the ground, but for mining material, so you would in fact be hitting hard material, not polishing points, but fracturing them. And